So this morning I want to familiarize you with one of the lesser-known authors of Scripture. Now, when we open up the book of Proverbs and begin talking about authorship, you might say, well, I know who wrote Proverbs. Solomon wrote Proverbs. And he's not a lesser-known guy. I know a little bit about Solomon. And if you said that, you'd be right. Solomon is the author of Proverbs, and he's a well-known character in the biblical story. But you may not realize Solomon is the only author of Proverbs. Because not only did Solomon say wise things, Solomon also collected wise sayings of other people. And this fits with the message of the book of Proverbs. Solomon tells us in Proverbs, part of wisdom is maintaining a humble teachability. An attitude that says, I don't already know it all. I still have more to learn. I need to listen to other people. And I think in implementation of that attitude, one of the things Solomon does is include the sayings of a man named Agur at the end of his book. So this is Proverbs 30 and verse 1, the words of Agur, son of Jacob, the oracle. So the question is, who is Agur? And the short answer is, we don't really know. I have a commentary on Proverbs that's about 600 pages long, which is to say the author has a lot to say about everything, and more than you want to hear sometimes. But here's all he has to say about Agur. Okay, this is what he says. We simply have no real idea of who this individual is. He's not mentioned in biblical or extra-biblical texts. So that's all we can really say about Agur. I think what we can infer about him is that he must have been some sort of a wise sage whose wisdom Solomon knew of somehow. And Solomon discerned that Agur had a good handle on the way the world worked. He had a good handle on human nature. He knew something about living the good life. And so Solomon saw fit, under inspiration, I believe, to include Agur's wisdom at the end of this book of wisdom. So the opening of chapter 30 records the first wise sayings of Agur, which we're not going to be studying. They're well worth studying. We'll reference a few of those things. But I actually want to pick up this morning in verse 11. One of the things Agur likes to do is to pose riddles. And what you're going to see is he likes to string together 3 or 4 things that seem to have nothing in common, and they ask the reader to identify the common thread. We're going to see Agur as a keen observer of nature, both animal nature and human nature. He is someone who carefully watches what happens in the world around him. He identifies trends, and from those he draws lessons about the kind of world we live in and about how best to get along in that world. But we're also going to see, to give us these lessons, he doesn't just tell us the answer. He doesn't really say, here's the moral of the story. Here's the thou shalt at the end of that. What he really does is he strings us along. He pushes us to ask the right questions. He doesn't just want to tell us how to live. He wants to teach us how to think and how to observe like he does. And so it's just really interesting stuff, and I think a lot of wisdom for our lives. So there are 6 riddles of Agur in this section I want to share with you. So here's riddle number 1, and I'm going to title each of these riddles and kind of give away what I think they're about. So riddle number 1 is about the trajectory of evil. So this is verse 11. There are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. There are those who are clean in their own eyes, but are not washed of their filth. There are those, how lofty are their eyes, how high their eyelids lift. There are those whose teeth are swords, whose fangs are knives, to devour the poor from off the earth, the needy from among mankind. So what's going on here? Let's first just notice a few things. What's listed here are about 4 different kinds of evil. You have in verse 11 the rebellious, in verse 12 the self-righteous, in verse 13 the proud, and in verse 14 the ruthless. So what's his point? Just that these kinds of people exist? Well, yes, they do, but give Agur a little more credit than that. The thing about a riddle is the author doesn't hold your hand and put the lesson at the end of it. It's sort of like a joke. If he has to spell out the punchline, it kind of loses its power. So let's puzzle this out. What do we notice about this collection of evil people? And I think the first good question to ask is, what's the trajectory of this riddle? How does it start and how does it end? So notice the riddle starts in verse 11 with a bad kid. There are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. That's how it starts. And it ends in verse 14 with this graphic description of basically like a cannibal whose teeth are swords and fangs are knives to devour the poor from off the earth. There seems to be a progression from an initial rebellion against one's parents to the worst kind of full-grown evil you can imagine. And in between this evil man's infancy in verse 11 and maturity in verse 14 is his psychology in verses 12 and 13. What's going on in between his ears? So it starts in the home, verse 11, where he curses his father and refuses to bless his mother. And if a man does not honor the authority of his parents, the first and most basic relationship we have, is he likely to respect the authority of anyone or anything else in his life? If he doesn't get that right, it doesn't bode well for our relationship with God, who gave us life, if we cannot honor the parents who gave us life. Well, instead of honoring his parents in verse 11, who does he honor in verse 12? Well, he honors himself. Agur says, despite the fact that his character in reality is filthy, and that word there he uses, mine translates filthy, is a very graphic word that literally means covered in excrement. Despite the fact that's his true character, he's filthy, in his own eyes he says he is clean. He can do no wrong. Now, nothing could be further from Agur's humble attitude about himself. In the opening of this chapter, in verses 1, 2, and 3, he says like this in verse 3, I have not learned wisdom, nor have I knowledge of the Holy One. I don't know anything. I'm a sinful man, he says. Agur demonstrates his awareness of his own shortcomings and sins, but the man in verse 12 is self-righteous through and through. So he doesn't honor his parents, he does honor himself. And when one thinks of himself so highly, how does he tend to think about others? That's verse 13. There are those, how lofty are their eyes, how high their eyelids lift. We have a saying that goes along with this. It goes something like this. He looks down his nose at everyone, right? He lifts up his eyelids. This is how he sees you. Looks down his nose. Everyone else, they're object of his scorn. They're not worthy of his attention. They're lower life forms. Here's what's going on in this riddle. It's raising the question, where does all this evil come from? How can people so heartlessly abuse and hurt others? How in the world do we get the people of verse 14? And Agur's answer is, they're not born, they're made. They're made by dysfunctional homes, verse 11, and they're made through perverted patterns of thought in verses 12 and 13. If the devil were in his lab trying to concoct a person who felt free to be as ruthless and cruel as the man in verse 14, if the devil's trying to make someone like that, this would be his formula. He would destabilize the home so that a man doesn't learn to respect his parents or the God who gave him life. He would let him, instead of glorifying God, glorify himself in verse 12 and then dehumanize others in verse 13. Agur is putting his finger on the trajectory of evil. It begins in the home and the heart. He's noticing when people in societies go bad, they go bad because homes are in disarray and because people think they're at the center of the universe. And I read this and I say, it's good. It's a good thing human nature has changed so radically in the last 3,000 years and this isn't true anymore. No, of course this is true. This has always been true. So in his first riddle, Agur puts his finger on the trajectory of evil. Where does heartless and cruel evil come from? And he gives us insight into these. That's riddle number one. Here's riddle number two, which I'm going to call the insatiable appetite. The insatiable appetite. So this is verse 15. The leech has two daughters, Give and Give. These are the names of the leeches, Give and Give. And then he says this, 3 things are never satisfied, 4 never say enough. So here are the 4 things. Sheol, the barren womb, the land never satisfied with water, and the fire that never says enough. So he begins talking about leeches here. Leeches are blood-sucking parasites who attach themselves to a host, and then they leech off them. And what Agur imagines here are a leech's offspring, twins who share the same name. Their names are Give and Give. They are named after what they constantly say. They're named after their mission in life, which is always saying give, 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 more, more, more. And they are never quenched, and they're never satiated, and they're always bloodthirsty. So, we have the leech. Agur then lists 4 more things that are never quenched or satisfied in verse 16. And so here are the 4 things. The first one is Sheol. Sheol in the Bible is the place of the dead. And his point is, Sheol never runs out of room. People continue to die day after day, and Sheol never says, we've reached full capacity here, no more dead people, please. Sheol is never satisfied. There's a line about this in Isaiah chapter 5 where the prophet says, Sheol has enlarged its throat and opened its mouth without measure. Sheol only ever says give, and Sheol never says enough, like the leech. The next one in verse 16 is the barren womb. And the idea here seems to be that a woman who longs for children but has none will not just shrug it off and have her disappointment quenched. She will only ever keep saying give. And this fits exactly, do you remember when Rachel is barren and childless, and she says this to Jacob, literally, she uses the same word as Agur does. Genesis 30 and verse 1, she says to Jacob, give me children or else I die. What Agur has noticed is the childless woman is not easily satisfied with her childlessness. The next one, the land never satisfied with water. You ever notice after a really good rain, the earth never says, you know, that was nice, I think we're good for the next few years, we won't need any more rain, we're satisfied here. No, the land only ever says give. We always need more rain, don't we? It never says enough. And then finally is the fire. The fire will never refuse another log. A forest fire doesn't stop because it decides I've had my fill of trees. It stops if it runs out of trees. The fire only ever says give, and it never says enough. So, what's Agur's point here? It's a riddle about insatiability. It's a riddle about unquenchable appetites. Agur has looked around the world and seen how much of it is characterized by this insatiability. And we're meant to continue thinking along those lines because, you know, we still live in a world that is governed by the words of the leech. Give, give, more, and never enough. We don't like the word enough, we like the word give. Isn't that the world we live in? Don't we have words for this kind of attitude? Consumerism, materialism, greed. Isn't that the world we live in? More money, more gadgets, more toys, more pleasure, more experiences, more food, more entertainment, more. Agur wants us to ask, is this really the shape I want my life to conform to? Is there a stopping place for my appetite? Is something like contentment possible? Or am I just another leech in the world, only ever saying give, give, give? And this really connects to the previous section where Agur offered a prayer of contentment and wished for contentment. So go back to verse 7. He says this, 2 things I ask of you, deny them not for me before I die. So the first thing is remove from me falsehood and lying. And here's the second thing he wants. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of God. Agur's asking, is there a way to pray for nothing? I'm not praying for riches. I'm not praying for poverty. I'm praying that I will be content with what I have. Is there a way to learn to be content with our relationship with God, with the blessings God has given us? Or are we just another leech who's only ever saying, give? I don't know about you, but I think Agur just has put his finger on the way the world has always worked. So that brings us to number 3, riddle number 3, what I'm going to call explanation-defying wonders. So what Agur does here is he lists 4 things that defy explanation, and then I think he adds in a 5th. And you'll see what I mean. This is verse 18. 3 things are too wonderful for me. 4 I do not understand. So here are the 4. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a virgin. So 4 things that defy explanation. The first is a way of an eagle in the sky. How does an eagle manage to effortlessly hang midair hundreds of feet above the ground? How does that happen? And, you know, don't talk to me about wind currents and the bone structure of birds and all of that. I'm not really asking about that. Just look up with your mouth open and have some wonder about it. It's kind of amazing, the kind of creatures God makes. The next one is the way of a serpent on a rock. This defies explanation. How can a smooth-bellied snake with no legs climb to the top of a smooth rock and cling there? How does that work? You know, scientists are still trying to explain how it is snakes manage to move so efficiently without legs. They have a name for the way snakes move. It's called concertina locomotion. They study this. You ever seen a snake climb a tree? You know they can. And when you learn that, it kind of scares you a little bit, creeps you out. Agur has just looked at the world and said, isn't it amazing the kind of creatures that are here? I can't really explain how this works. I'm just amazed that it does. The next one, the way of a ship on the high seas. So here's a question. How is it that a massive ship, weighed down with hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo, can float on the ocean like it's nothing? How is it that that's possible? But if you drop your cell phone in the lake, it drops straight to the bottom. Don't we kind of live in a strange world? Defies explanation. How does this work? Agur's just looking around and saying, wow, I can't explain a lot of the world. I'm just in wonder at it. And the final one in verse 19 is the way of a man with a virgin. He is describing here the magnetic attraction a young man has to a young woman. And we're still at a loss to explain all the science of attraction and beauty and all of that. And the people who have the hardest time describing love and attraction are the people who are in love. You know, they can't make a coherent sentence about it. And he just has noticed the way of people, just as he noticed the way of animals, and said it's just an interesting, strange, unexplainable world we live in. So here's what I think is happening. Verse 19 is a setup. 4 observations about things that defy explanation. But if you keep reading, I believe verse 20 is a jarring 5th thing that defies explanation. And this has been where he's headed all along. Verse 20, he says this. This is the way of an adulteress. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I have done no wrong. The first 4 in verse 19 are innocent observations about wonders of the world. But then in verse 20, there's a concerning 5th observation about how some people can do such evil with no remorse, with no pang of conscience. The adulteress here. The adulteress is a sort of a recurring character in Proverbs. The adulteress, he describes, has just finished the sin that gives her her name. It's euphemistically described here as eating. And he says when she gets done with her meal, when she gets done with her sin, she cleans herself up, totally content with life, totally content with her choices, not feeling a single shred of shame. I'll read you what one man has said about this riddle. He said, the greatest wonder of all, and that which is most beyond understanding, may be mankind's utter insensibility to the creation and gifts of God. How can a creature so quickly and thoroughly forget their Creator? That's what's being described in verse 20. So altogether here, verses 18 through 20, I think Agur's riddle manages to capture both the awe-inspiring wonder of God's creation, verse 19, as well as the head-shaking realities of sin in verse 20. Put it this way, all around us we can find evidence for the truth of Genesis 1, that God has made the world and all of these wonders, and at the same time we can look around and see evidence for the truth of Genesis 3 and the entrance of sin into that world. The beauty of God's creation defies explanation, but sadly the sinfulness and seared consciences of mankind also defy explanation. God made man in his own image. What an amazing thing that is. And yet those image-bearing creatures have managed to mar the image of God in them beyond recognition. And so we have explanation-defying wonders, for better and also for worse. We're at a loss to explain a lot of our world. That brings us to riddle number 4. Riddle number 4 is about earthly irritants. Earthly irritants. This is verse 21. Under 3 things the earth trembles. Under 4 it cannot bear up. So here are the 4. A slave when he becomes king, and a fool when he is filled with food, an unloved woman when she gets a husband, and a maidservant when she displaces her mistress. So this is a riddle about people. There are 2 men and 2 women, about people who are so unbearable that even the earth can't stand it. That the earth looks up at them and looks at what's happening and just says, I just can't tolerate this. And what they all have in common, what all of these 4 people have in common, is that they are unprepared to handle their good fortune. So, one at a time. A slave when he becomes a king. There's actually a story about this in the book of Kings. There's a guy named Zimri who was previously a slave. He displaces King Asa from the throne, and then Zimri proceeds to be a total disaster of a king. It's the story of many revolutions in history. You know, the skills it takes to run a successful revolution rarely translate into running a successful government. That often, the slave seizes power only to use that power to get even with all those who wronged him and to become a despot and all that, which is one of the remarkable things about the American Revolution, by the way, because the revolutionaries turned out to be excellent governors. But a slave, when he becomes a king, the earth looks at this and says, this isn't going to go well. Next, a fool when he is filled with food. This is irritating to the earth, a fool when he is filled with food. And I think this idea of being filled with food is not just, the fool has a good meal. It's a way of saying the fool experiences prosperity. The fool has a lot. He becomes rich. When a fool wins a lottery, how is that going to go? What happens to most lottery winners? It never goes well. It brings out the worst in him. It accentuates his selfishness and his obnoxiousness. And in the end, he's going to be worse off for his good fortune. A fool when he is filled with food. A person unprepared for good fortune, when he experiences it, it's going to be worse for him, not better. Next, verse 23 now. An unloved woman when she gets a husband. This is irritating to the earth. The word he uses here for unloved is a word more commonly in the Old Testament translated hated. And so it's not really describing the fact that other people don't like her, though that is a part of it. It's the fact that she's unlikable. It's kind of well earned. So what this is about a bitter and discontent woman getting a husband. And what he says is, marriage doesn't solve her bitterness. Marriage just creates another victim of her bitterness. She's unprepared for her good fortune, and so she turns what should be a blessing of God, marriage, into misery. And then finally, in verse 23, is a maidservant when she displaces her mistress. This is similar to a slave becomes king idea. In Genesis, when Hagar becomes the concubine of Abram, kind of a second wife, it says she tormented Sarah. And I think there's probably a lot of blame to go around in that whole situation. It's a disaster from top to bottom. But part of it is Hagar started acting like she was Abraham's favorite. And so a maidservant, when she displaces her mistress, that's irritating. So what's this riddle about? Here's what these four things have in common. Not all the good things that happen to us are good for us, especially if we have giant character flaws. Getting power and money, verse 22, will not solve all of our problems. In fact, they will only accentuate the problems that were already there. Getting married is not always the solution to our unhappiness. Actually, if we are bitter and discontent in our singleness, we usually just bring bitter and discontentment to our marriage. If we're unprepared to be single well, we're probably not very well prepared to be married well. What Agur is noticing is we tend to assume external change is all that stands between us and happiness. If I just had more power, if I just had more money, if I just was married, if I just changed my external situation, that would solve all my problems. And he says, no, it won't solve all your problems. If your problems are in your heart, you need to solve the heart problems. And only then will you be prepared to handle external change. In reality, internal change is our greatest need. It brings us to riddle number 5. Riddle number 5 is about the power of small. This is verse 24. 4 things on earth are small, but are exceedingly wise. So here are the 4. The ants are a people not strong, yet they provide their food in the summer. The rock badgers are a people not mighty, yet they make their homes in the cliffs. The locusts have no king, yet all of them march in rank. The lizard you can take in your hands, yet it is in king's palaces. If yours says a different animal in that verse, we'll talk about that in a second. So let's go one at a time. Ants, verse 25. Ants, he notices, are not particularly impressive creatures. Now, we could talk about, ants are very strong for their size. They can lift like however many times their body weight. They pick up a crumb that's, 3 times the size. But even then, ants are so small it's not overly impressive. But what impresses Agur about ants? What impresses him in verse 25 is they provide their food in summer. Ants work hard, and ants plan ahead. And actually, the book of Proverbs loves to use ants as examples. This is Proverbs 6 and verse 8. Having no chief, officer, or ruler, ants prepare their food in summer and gather provision in the harvest. So what they lack in size, they make up for in planning and in work. He has watched ants prepare for the dry season. And he says, you know what? They have more wisdom than a lot of people I know. Next, verse 26. Rock badgers. This is an animal. It's about the size of a rabbit. Not a particularly mighty species, he says. Easy prey under sort of equal circumstances to a bigger and a meaner animal. But what's impressive about the rock badger, verse 26? Well, they make their homes in the cliffs. They adapt to live in harsh conditions at high altitudes to stay out of reach of most predators. They live in places a predator doesn't want to go. And so what they lack in size, what they lack in strength, they make up for in resilience. They make up for in wisdom. You don't look at them and say that's an impressive animal, but when you see how they live, how they conduct themselves, how they adapt themselves to the way the world is, they are impressive. Verse 27. You wouldn't think twice if you saw a grasshopper, a locust. He says there's no king grasshopper, there's no royalty, there's no government. And yet he says somehow all of them march in rank. They all seem to know where to go. They're all on the same page. There is incredible unity and power in a swarm of locusts. Just look at Exodus and the plagues. Just look at the book of Joel, which is about a swarm of locusts who God sends in judgment. What they lack in leadership or individual impressiveness, they make up for in unity. Now, verse 28. If you have a King James version, it has the word spider there. But I'm told lizard is probably the word. You can hold a lizard in your hand. We've got little geckos all around our house and our yard and stuff like that. And, kids like to, they pick them up and play with them and stuff. And, they rip off the tail and, all that stuff. There's nothing particularly impressive about a little lizard. But what he notices in verse 28 is, it wouldn't at all be unexpected to enter a king's palace and to find that same kind of lizard there. There is an ingenuity. There is a persistence in lizard. That they're unassuming, but actually that unassuming thing allows them to go places you will never go. You don't look at them and say, that's impressive, except that lizard could be in a king's palace long before you'll ever be there. What Agur has observed in these unimpressive creatures on the surface, he's looked at them a little closer and discovered a profound truth, which is size, power, strength are not everything. These small creatures are capable of things no lion could ever do. Work, wisdom, resilience, unity, cunning. These are often more powerful than just raw power. To put it another way, David versus Goliath plays out in nature all the time. Goliath looks big and bad, except Goliath ain't all that smart. And David, who's got some wisdom about him, David will always win out. That's riddle number 5, the power of small. Sixth and finally, the last riddle of Agur is about play-acting stateliness. We'll explain what we mean. This is verse 29. 3 things are stately in their tread. 4 are stately in their stride. So here are the 4. The lion, which is mightiest among beasts, and does not turn back before any. The strutting cock, the he-goat, and a king whose army is with him. So, this is a riddle about stateliness. Stately is a word that means dignified, unhurried, grand, royal. It's a picture of someone who's totally confident, who's not afraid of anything else, who's unconcerned with the opinion of anyone else. They just walk around with their chest puffed out. They're not afraid of what anyone else thinks. And so verse 30, the lion is the perfect example of this. The lion is the king of the jungle. He's at the top of the food chain. He's not the hunted, he is the hunter. A lion is stately. A lion is not walking around the jungle worried, looking over his shoulder. He's the king. Now, the next animal he mentions is another one where it's translated in a lot of different ways. The rooster, the war horse, the greyhound. And the reason why translators differ on what animal it is, because literally this is what the Hebrew says of this animal. It's called the girded of loins. That's all it says in Hebrew, the girded of loins. And this is thought to have been a nickname for a particular kind of animal that ancient readers would have known about. They would have said the girded of loins. Oh, we know what kind of animal that is. So, the strutting rooster gets the point across pretty well, right? The rooster walks around like he owns the place, right? He's stately in his tread. A peacock would also work. And then the next one also works, the he-goat, the billy goat walking around. It's sort of funny to watch, but the billy goat kind of acts like he owns the place. And then finally, the human example of this kind of stateliness is the king with his army behind him. We have a sarcastic comeback to when someone tries to order us around and is kind of getting too big for their britches. sometimes they tell us to do something, they only have a right to tell us, and so we say, yeah, you and whose army? Well, this guy literally has one. When he comes up to you and tells you what to do, unless you've got an army bigger than his, what he says kind of goes, and he knows it. So what's the point of this riddle? We have these animals and then this person who's walking around like they own the place. What's the point of this riddle? I think the last two verses here of Agur helps decode what's going on here. So this is verse 32 now. If you have been foolish, exalting yourself, or if you have been devising evil, put your hand on your mouth. For pressing milk produces curds, pressing the nose produces blood, and pressing anger produces strife. This is where Agur's headed. There is a temptation we all have to act as stately as the creatures in verses 29 through 31. There is this temptation for us to walk around with our chest puffed out, to act like we're hot stuff, to say no one can tell me anything. I know what I'm doing, I'm in charge. There is that temptation to act that way, but then in verse 32 there is the reality, which is that none of us are the king of the jungle. And he says, if we have been acting like we are, if you have been foolishly exalting yourself, if you've been acting like the king of the jungle, just know reality is going to hit back at some point, and you're begging for strife. One of the through lines of Agur's Proverbs has been humility. We mentioned here the opening verses of chapter 30, where he says in verse 2, surely I am too stupid to be a man. I have not the understanding. I have not learned wisdom, nor have I knowledge of the Holy One. One of the through lines of Agur's Proverbs has been humility. Here he says the way of pride is a way of strife and humiliation. Even a lion, who does have some stateliness, who does have some power, even the lion eventually gets devoured by a pack of jackals. Those who live by might die by might. No, it's not the way of power and bravado and pride that's the way to a good life. No, it's the way of humility. It's having a good understanding of who you are and living a life that. So I've always just loved this whole chapter. Again, the opening few verses that we didn't study are well worth your time as well. But Agur is a man who has carefully watched what happens in the world around him. He's seen the way the world works. And from his observations about nature, about animals, and about people, he draws lessons about what kind of world we live in and how to get along in that world. And so through his riddles, he teaches us the evil and the ruthless don't become that overnight. They grow into it with rebellion, with pride, with arrogance. He's taught us in the second riddle that the greedy have appetites which are never satisfied, and we're going to have to work hard and go against the grain of a lot of the world to learn to be content. He has said there are both wonderful things in the third riddle. There are both wonderful things in God's creation beyond comprehension, and there are also terrible things in God's creation beyond comprehension. The wonder of creation in Genesis 1 is quickly followed by the wonder of sin in Genesis 3. In the next riddle, he's taught us good things that happen to us might not always be good for us. That our deepest problems are internal, which means the external things we hope for to solve everything, we hope for power, we hope for wealth, we hope for a change in our marital situation. The external things we hope for cannot make us whole all by themselves. Often they just make us and everyone else more miserable if we're ill-equipped for them. If we can't handle little, we probably won't handle a lot very well. He's taught us size and strength aren't everything, and he's taught us in this last riddle that the proud need to tap the brakes before their pride is unmasked as bluster. So let me say this as we wrap up. Never let us think, never let us say that the Bible is some ancient document, irrelevant to our modern lives. The Bible doesn't really understand the way the world works today. We have the internet now. We have iPhones, and we've grown past all of this stuff. Never be under the impression that the authors of Scripture are out of touch with the way things are. Now, I need to clarify, sometimes a preacher can be out of touch, but the Bible never is. See, Agur here has human nature pegged. He understands the way people work in a way Google's algorithm could never reveal to you. And if we'll have ears to hear, we'll discover insights about the world we live in. We'll understand better the people we come across, and we'll better understand the inner workings of our own heart if we'll listen closely to Agur's riddles, to Agur's wisdom. And so that's Proverbs chapter 30. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the rest of the week with you.